In this video, we're going to look at Piaget's preoperational stage. One thing we'll see that's different about this, talking about this stage, is that we tend to talk about what children can't do rather than what they can do. That may seem odd because why would you talk about what they can't do instead of talking about what they can do? The reason Piaget does this is by looking at what they can't do, it actually does, in a sense, tell us what they can do. It's a backwards way of looking at things, but it does work. Let's start off looking about what some of these limitations are. First, we have the idea of egocentrism. If you remember, with Piaget's theory, there's egocentrism at every stage. The only difference between the stages is the form the egocentrism takes. For preoperational egocentrism, it has to do with perspective taking. Specifically, it has to do with symbolic representation of viewpoints. Saying symbolic may seem strange to you, but think of it as a picture, because that's what Piaget was doing. Piaget was showing children pictures and then trying to see if they could understand what somebody else's viewpoint would be in that picture. Let's look at his classic three-mountain problem to better understand this. In his three-mountain problem, the child is seated on this side, and when looking at the table, this mountain with the tree on top is closer than the mountain with the Statue of Liberty on top, or the mountain with Mount Rushmore on it. So the child would see this photograph and then be asked, for example, what would the person seated directly across from them see? In other words, which mountain would be closer to them? With preoperational thinking, the child is going to say whichever mountain's closest to the child. In this case, the child would say the mountain with the tree, rather than saying the mountain with Mount Rushmore on it. Because if we would flip this picture around, and the child was actually sitting on the other side, the child would see that this mountain, actually you can't see anything, you can't see Mount Rushmore on the other side because you're looking at it from the back, but that would be the mountain closest to it, and the other two would be farther away. And that was the basic thing that Piaget found, is when you're showing them a symbolic representation, and again, think about a photograph is a symbolic representation because you're seeing it in two dimensions. You're not actually there. If we had the child actually there, the child would do okay. Now, if we look at what do we know currently about the three-mountain problem? Well, we know at 4 years old that children can pass this test if we use something that they're more familiar with. So, if we use something other than photographs, maybe actually take them into the room, maybe have a 3D model, something that's not quite as flat as a photograph. Because think about our experience, we have to learn what things mean in a photograph. Now that may seem strange to you, but if you take Introduction to Psychology, in the sensation inception chapter, you'll see that we learn how far away things in the photograph are compared to each other based upon various cues. We call these monocular cues. We won't get into that here, but the point is understanding distance in the photograph takes some practice. And if you look at primitive cultures that haven't had experience with photographs, they don't do very well in that task. Next, let's look at some of the limitations of preoperational thinking. The main one of these is the inability to conserve. In this case, when we talk about conservation, we're not talking about ecology. We're talking about that things that appear to change really haven't. So this is a very abstract concept, and looking at some examples might make it easier. One of the tasks Piaget gave to children was called the conservation of liquid task. All of these different examples we're going to look at all involve concentrations. It's just using a different example. With liquids, we have a child sitting at a table. Next, we show them two glasses that are exactly the same size and shape, and both of these glasses have the same amount of liquid in them. Then we put an empty glass that's taller and thinner than the other two glasses. The child then watches an adult pour the liquid from one of those two glasses into the third taller glass. Then the child is asked which glass has more water. Children at the preoperational stage will say the glass that's taller and thinner has more water, and if you ask them why, they'll say it's taller. Well, we know as adults that the two glasses have the same amount of water. But we'll look at a couple more examples, and then we'll try to unpack why do children at this stage make this mistake. The next example Piaget did was conservation of mass, where he took two balls of clay that were exactly the same, gave them to the child, and then the adult took one of the balls, flattened it, and rolled it into like a sausage. The child was then asked which of the two is bigger, which has more mass. Preoperational children will say the one that's longer and thinner, because they're looking at the length, and they're saying there's more there. Even though they could see that it was the same ball, just reshaped. Final example, Piaget looked at numbers. For this task, children were shown two rows of checkers. The rows of checkers were exactly the same length, had the same number of checkers in each row. The experimenter then took one of the rows and kind of squished them all together. So now you got a pile of checkers rather than a row. The child was asked which one has more checkers. Preoperational children will consistently say the one that's still in the row has more checkers because it's longer. So let's next look at why this occurs. One of the reasons is Piaget said children at this stage are perception bound. In other words, seeing is believing for them. What their eyes tell them is the truth. Now, you could say that's true for all of us, except as adults, we interpret what our eyes see. We don't just say, okay, here's what the eyes see, that's all there is. But for children, they focus on just the appearance, and they're missing other characteristics or factors about that object that could explain why it looks different. So we can say children tend to centrate. So what he meant by, or I should say center, not centrate, but centration is referring to the fact that children center or focus on one task, one aspect, and ignore others. Another reason conservation is difficult for preoperational children has to do with the term we call irreversibility. What Piaget meant by irreversibility is children can't reverse their thinking. A simple example of this is you tell a child that they're walking down the street, and as they walk down the street, they first see a lion, then a tower, a tree, and finally a house. The experimenter will ask the child to repeat back the order of the things the child saw. And children do fine with this. But if you ask the child to say it backwards, start with the last thing you saw and end with the first thing you saw, they have difficulty. In this diagram, you can see they get a couple things out of order. And Piaget determined from these observations that they're not capable of reversing their thinking. Let's take a practical example. If you have a child who is in preoperational stage and you give that child a cookie, then you give her brother 2 cookies because he's older, she's going to complain that she wants 2 cookies too because it's not fair that she only gets 1. Because she's in the preoperational stage, you can take that 1 cookie and break it in half and give her the 2 halves, and she'll be happy. Because in her mind, she now has 2 cookies, not 1. Even though she saw you break it in half, she sees that as 2, not 1. Piaget argued that part of that problem is she can't reverse her thinking. She can't, in her mind, recombine the 2 halves and see it's just 1 cookie. Another reason for inability to conserve is focusing on states rather than transformations. What Piaget meant by that was before and after. If we look at all those examples of conservation, the children were comparing the before you started doing anything and then the after. So if we look at the liquid, conservation of liquid, they focused on how the glasses looked at before you poured one from the other and then after you did the pouring. And they ignore the middle part, the actual process of pouring. Sometimes researchers will call that static reasoning, and the reason is the word static means doesn't change. The opposite of static would be dynamic. Now as adults, we do more dynamic reasoning because we're focusing on the process of how we got from before to after. But the children just see the two. They don't seem to pay attention to, well, they see it, they see the during, but they don't regard it as important. Another limitation of preoperational thinking is what Piaget called animistic thinking, or in some textbooks, just animism. Think about the word itself. Animistic or animism is similar to the word animal or also animate. Closer to, I guess it probably derives from animate. And so if you animate something, you bring it to life. For preoperational thinking, what this means is you give things that aren't alive lifelike properties. In this photograph, we see a teddy bear with a band-aid on and a bandage on its left arm. The child may have accidentally knocked their teddy bear off their bed and it hit the floor. And therefore the child says, well, the teddy bear is hurt, I need to bandage it. Obviously the teddy bear can't feel any pain and doesn't think about things because it's not alive. But children at this stage tend to give lifelike properties to things like stuffed animals, clouds, things like that. We can tie animism to magical thinking as well. It may seem strange to do this, but it's kind of interesting to do so because it helps us understand what children are thinking. Around 3 to 4, we found that children understand that magical events don't happen in their lives. In other words, if they're watching a TV show that has magic in it, they realize that magic may occur in those TV shows, but it doesn't happen to them. They don't seem to have magic or see magic. And we've also found that when children can't explain something, why did this happen, or why did that happen, they sometimes will use magic as an explanation. There's been quite a bit of research looking at why do they say that. One explanation is that we as adults tell them that. That may sound strange. You might think, no, I've never said to a kid that's magic. But think about the magical creatures we tell children about. Santa Claus, the Easter Bunny. All these characters have magic and can do things that nobody else can do. And so we believe that part of the reason when children can't explain something they might think it's magic, because we've told them that before. Like how can Santa deliver presents to over 3 or 4 or 6 or 12 billion people? Well, it's magic. If you think about it, if you look back at the history of our civilization, more primitive cultures have used magic as an example too. A great example is an eclipse. Back in ancient times, people thought eclipses were a result of maybe some kind of, like in one culture, the idea there's this cosmic snake that swallows up the sun, and the people have to do a ritual to get the cosmic snake to leave and throw the sun back up so that we can see. Today we know that's not what happens with an eclipse, but you'll find if you look at a lot of ancient societies or more primitive cultures, sometimes they also use magic to explain things. But when we get around 4 to 8, children don't use magic and they don't believe in magic as much as they did before. And that is important, because think about, there are some parents who may not want their kids to read stories that involve magic or watch movies that involve magic, such as the Harry Potter series. There's been a variety of people saying, no, that this encourages witchcraft. But if you look at the research, children don't view that as, Harry Potter is doing magic, I can do that too. They realize that that's different from their day-to-day lives, as we've already saw. So we'll stop there, and in the next video we'll look at Vygotsky's theory.